I work in adult education in East London, and I'm a feminist involved in the group Feminist Fight Back. Really pleased to be here this evening to introduce Liz's talk. First of all, a little bit about the series. So this year we're marking 50 years since the dramatic year of 1968, with a new series of discussion meetings on the social histories of revolution, the long 1960s. And this series follows from the very successful events of last year, which I know many of you attended, where we marked the centenary of the Russian Revolution with a series of talks on the social histories of 1917 and the early years of revolutionary Russia. So the meetings in this series are focusing on the revolutionary events that swept the world starting in the 1960s. So the 1968 general strike in France, the 1975 Portuguese Revolution, and the social movements that swept the United States and Europe, revolts that shook the Middle East, Latin America, and other parts of the global south, up to and including the Iranian Revolution of 1979, as well as contemporaneous movements in the so-called socialist countries. So the sessions are opened by historians who studied these movements, or by people who participated in them as militants. And at each meeting there's going to be an opening talk of around about 30 minutes, followed by discussion. We've also got a little bit of a film clip that we'll watch tonight as well before the discussion. So these aren't academic seminars in the usual sense, and we encourage attendance and participation by everyone. So we'll have some question and answer after Liz's talk, but there'll also be a chance for general discussion as well. So our emphasis here is on the social histories of these movements, so how they were experienced by the mass of working people who took part in them. And the aim is to try and reach a deeper understanding of revolution as the active participation of millions of people in changing history. And we hope that our discussions will provoke us all to think about what is a revolution. Tonight's session will be opened by Liz Leicester. Liz is a historian, an adult education tutor, and a trade union activist. And Liz's research has included the impact of the 1798 Irish Rebellion on English Chartism, radical movements in Victorian England, local history in areas of northwest London, the impact of memory on historical constructs, and the role of women in the British trade union movement. Liz is tutored for the Workers' Educational Association and Unite, and was chair of the Camden local government branch of Unison for 14 years. Liz's talk this evening is entitled "You're Not a Worker, You're a Pair of Hands," and she will inform us about, and we'll have a chance for discussion about, the unofficial Leeds clothing strike of 1970. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks very much, Alice. If this is okay, loud enough, everybody? Yeah? Okay. I think that I want to start by saying, as Alice has said, this is part of the series Social Histories of Revolution. And you might wonder, why is a strike among women workers in Leeds in 1970 part of that programme? There was no revolution in Great Britain in the 60s or 70s in the sense that the other discussions are about. But there was an unprecedented upsurge in militant action by the working class, organised in trade unions, which seemed to some on the right and some on the left to be the beginning of a revolution. In undertaking this research, I was interested in the history of women, particularly working class women, and the part they played in the tumultuous 60s and 70s. The study of history is dependent upon the questions historians ask and how they answer them. What's the focus of their interest? What do they think is important to study, and how have they studied it? What resources have they used? How have they interpreted the evidence? Historians are not outside history. They're shaped by it, as we all are, by the climate, political, economic that we grow up and live in. In other words, history has a history, and I think that's a very important point to make. The study of the part women have played in history really developed in the 60s and 70s, though one of the major works studying working class women, called Women Workers and the Industrial Revolution by Ivy Pinchbeck, was actually written in 1930. In it, she established many of the frameworks that guided later feminist history: the centrality of work and women's economic role, patriarchal control of resources, the shape of the family, who controls wages, women's work and wages in relation to men, still a very, very live question. Organized struggle by women was not new. Historians looked back into the 17th and 18th centuries and discovered evidence of unheard voices and the militancy of women workers during the Industrial Revolution. An editorial in the Times of the 2nd of June 1808 describing unrest among Lancashire weavers said that, quote, "The women are, if possible, more turbulent and mischievous than the men. Their insolence to the soldiers and special constables is intolerable." One of the most influential strikes in the Victorian era was by 1,400 mostly young women matchmakers in the Bryant and May factory in 1888. Ben Tillett, who was one of the leaders of the dockers' strike of 1889, paid tribute to the young women workers who were the sisters, mothers, wives, daughters of the dockers. He wrote their strike was the beginning of the social convulsion which produced what's called the new unionism. That is, trade unions which were open to all workers and not just the skilled. Mary MacArthur established the National Federation of Women Workers in 1906, and in its short existence it fought more strikes and did more to establish women as trade unionists than any previous organization. So these are just a couple of examples. There's a real continuity of struggle by women, which has been very influential. The number of strikes increased significantly during the 60s, trebling by 1970. Strikes spread from the traditionally militant areas, such as the mines, the docks, the cars, the shipbuilding, into the public sector. Along with the broadening of class demands went an extension of class organization into sectors which had been previously not as well organized, which included women and black workers as well. Some new and some rediscovered tactics were used, such as occupations, mass picketing, and solidarity action. The number of strike days rose from less than 5 million in 1968 to 13.5 million in 1971 and 23.9 million in 1972. By the late 1960s, 95% of all strikes in Britain were unofficial, that is, without the union support and often against the union's advice. The militancy was a significant revolt against capital, I think, both in the unpredictability of the movement, but also its rank-and-file subversion of trade union bureaucracy. It was indicative of increased confidence of organized workers in what had been an era of post-war full employment, as well, of course, as the development of the welfare state, and also of workplace union democracy. But it was also an indication of the shrinking of British manufacturing, an economic and financial crisis, and the impact of new technology with its subsequent threat to jobs, such as on the docks. In 1972, 1 million people were unemployed. It was 2 million by 1978. The 1971 Industrial Relations Act was the Tory government's initial response, though the next Labour government later repealed it, and then Thatcher brought it all back. In it, so-called secondary picketing, that is, picketing not directly aimed at the worker's own employer, was made illegal. When a container company was granted an injunction under the Act for striking dock shop stewards' continuing refusal to allow container lorries into the docks, 5 stewards from Tilbury were arrested and taken to Pentonville Prison in North London. Between July 22nd, when the Pentonville 5 were imprisoned, and the 1st of August, when they were released, at least 170,000 workers came out in their support. And they included car workers, bus drivers, printers, engineering workers, miners, market workers, container drivers. A huge march went up the Caledonian Road to Pentonville Prison, which some people here, the older people, will probably remember. And someone previously unheard of, called an official solicitor, miraculously appeared and got the men out of prison, which defused the movement at the time. In 1972, as well as dock strikes, there was a building workers' strike, which resulted in the imprisonment of Des Warren and Ricky Tomlinson under 19th century conspiracy laws. And in 1976, Asian women in a small factory in Willesden struck in support of their demand for union recognition. They were joined on the picket lines by hundreds of miners, post office workers, and others, and held out for 2 years. The 1970s ended in the so-called Winter of Discontent in 1979, when public sector workers across the country went on strike, as well as oil tanker drivers and lorry drivers. The wave of rank-and-file resistance seemed part of an unstoppable advance. The Labour Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, told the engineering union leader, who was a left-wing union leader, Hugh Scanlon, to, quote, "get his tanks off my lawn." A politician from the Ministry of Labour thought the country could well be on the brink of revolution. A British civil servant told a journalist in late 1973, "I have to tell you we must prepare for a possible revolution in this country." And according to one historian, after years of denial, it's now been proved that army officers, a small group, were seriously considering a military takeover in 1974-75. The unofficial strike by 30,000 clothing workers in Leeds in 1970 over equal pay was typical in many ways of other unofficial strikes of the time. It remains a largely undocumented strike, with the exception of a work by a woman called Katrina Honeyman on the Leeds clothing workers, and a piece in the Trade Union Register of 1970. The strike is sometimes considered to be of less importance than the 1968 Women Ford Machinist strike, which led to the 1970 Equal Pay Act. Contemporary sources are also scarce, so I was faced with the task of discovering sources of information sometimes rejected in academic history, such as memory. Though memory as a source has gained more credence in recent years through oral and public history and the work of historians such as Alessandro Portelli, there is a tension between memory and history. Memory is sometimes discarded as false. Rather than analyzed as an important resource, even in its falseness, it can reveal much historical information. I made contact with some of those who'd been involved in the strike to explore what they remembered, their role in it, and whether they thought it had been won or lost. This included strikers, union officials, shop stewards, and supporters. It was important to consider why we remember events in the changing context of political class and gender relationships. Who remembers what? What narratives have been constructed? Was there a mythical narrative about the strike, and does its significance relate to senses of identity? As memories are altered with the passing of time, the past is filtered and framed through what has happened since, and new experiences continually shape what we remember. To reflect on the Leeds strike of 1970 is to revisit pre-Margaret Thatcher Britain, an era of massive industrial unrest, a place that might seem a foreign country to many younger people. In February 1970, clothing workers in Leeds began to walk out of their factories on unofficial strike in support of their demand for a £1 an hour pay increase. The action snowballed, and remember, this is before decimalisation, so a shilling is 5 pence. That's 5 new pence. Right? The action snowballed as strikers marched around the city, going from factory to factory, calling on others to join them. Day after day, workers joined the strike until there were more than 30,000 on strike, according to the Trade Union Register. The strike was an angry response to an agreement between the union, the National Union of Tailors and Garment Workers, and the Clothing Manufacturers Federation, which came into effect at the beginning of 1970. This established new minimum rates of 6 shillings 7 pence an hour for skilled men and 4 shillings 9 pence an hour for skilled women, with decreasing rates of pay for less skilled workers. It also introduced the first nationally negotiated productivity agreement in the industry. So low wages, differentials between men and women's rates of pay, and an unacceptable productivity agreement were all factors behind the strike. George Little, chairman of the Leeds and Northern Clothing Manufacturers Association, said, and this is a quote, "The Leeds employers still do not know quite what hit them. They freely admit they never dreamed a calamity of this size could ever befall an industry whose workers, mostly women, have so often been content to accept a low wage rather than travel a mile down the road for something better. We witnessed a unique spectacle of not only women marching through the streets of the city, but also female pickets calling at individual factories in an endeavour to bring out the work people in support of the strike. This must be almost unique in British industrial disputes." The relatively inexperienced strikers employed the technique which came to be known as flying pickets, a method of organising prominent in later strikes in the miners and the mines and building worker struggles. The union issues a statement in response to the first walkout at John Collier's. The strike was unofficial and against their advice, and they insisted the pay agreement had been freely entered into. They warned, quote, "It is a negation of everything the trade union movement stands for, to break an agreement so obviously beneficial to the vast majority of the membership covered. Members on strike should consider the issues carefully and not be misled by misstatements regarding the policy decision." In the 4th week of the strike, with the clothing industry in Leeds at a standstill, and the strikers approaching workers in other parts of the country, full-time union officials called a meeting of shop stewards at which they put forward a resolution calling on the stewards to recommend a return to work so the union could begin negotiations. The strike committee was outmaneuvered, and the vote to recommend a return to work was won by 83 to 76. However, a mass meeting of over 4,000 strikers the following day voted unanimously to stay out. And this was a point when people could just put their hands up in the air and say, we're staying out. It's a different world from now. A further meeting of stewards was put under intense pressure by union officials again, and then they agreed once again to recommend a return to work, and this time the strikers went back. Ultimately, the new agreement negotiated by the union following the return to work gave increases of 10 pence per hour for women and 8 pence per hour for men on top of the negotiations already agreed. And the new agreement was subject to ratification by the membership. I looked at coverage of the strike in the local and national press and in two socialist newspapers, the Trotskyist Workers' Press and the Stalinist Morning Star, papers of the Socialist Labor League and the Communist Party, respectively. While they were often similar in the content of their reporting, the Morning Star called it the tailors' strike, using the job title of the group of men best paid in the industry, an odd choice of words because most of the strikers were women and not tailors at all. Workers' Press was highly critical of the union leaders throughout. The strikers complained about the lack of coverage in the national press. They may have been referring to tabloid newspapers, but it was also true of papers like The Times. Most of their late in the day coverage was in the business news section, unlike that of other disputes going on at the same time in car factories such as Ford's or among postal workers and teachers, which were all featured on the front pages and obviously seen as having a larger impact nationally. While Workers' Press maintained the strike was betrayed and the Morning Star emphasized the gains made by the strikers, The Times quoted the strike committee statement that the decision had been taken in order to avoid damaging the industry. In fact, the industry was already in decline, like most manufacturing industry in Britain by this time. The Garment Worker, the union's official journal, came out each month during the years preceding and following the Leeds strike. No articles or photographs appeared to illustrate and describe the strike or its impact on the lives of workers. There were no letters of criticism, either of the unofficial action or of the union's official position in the letters pages. In its March 1970 edition, the only reference to the strike is an executive committee statement which acknowledged, quote, the widespread and justifiable feelings of frustration and resentment at the industry's low wage structure, and urged members on strike should return to work to enable immediate and meaningful negotiations to begin, a phrase that we've heard many times active in the trade union movement. In April, the journal featured an article headlined, Special Conference Gives Massive Support to Executive, not to the strikers, to the executive. In the only direct reference to the Leeds clothing workers, the article says that, in quotes, the militants, mainly from Leeds, were praised in some quarters for their unofficial strike. But that was it, and the executive board was given the praise for negotiating a better deal than was there before. The union did not want to publicize an unofficial strike in which many saw their leadership, as described by one shop steward, incompetent, inept, and at times downright bloody cowardly. I did actually interview the man who was the president of the union at the time, but then he changed his mind and decided he did not want his interview to appear in any shape or form in anything. So I had to respect that. The male-led union was not organized or motivated in 1970 to ensure that the expectations and aspirations of its largely female membership were represented. The silence about the strike also occurs in the context of the 1968 Ford strike, which I've already mentioned, and the big and highly publicized strikes later in the 70s by workers who were seen as the heavyweights of the union movement, as they were at that time. Voices from the strike can be heard in an unpublished essay written in 1973 by Diane Ruth Gold, Collective Action Among Women in the Leeds Clothing Industry. Gold found that most of the women struggled to participate actively in the union. Between 10 and 15 women attended branch meetings regularly, but the only woman to speak regularly was Gertie Roach. Most women were inhibited at the male-dominated meetings. Sylvia Patey-Johns, a steward at Burton's factory, described the situation for women in the union. I sometimes think there isn't a lot of sympathy with women workers, you know. It's more or less like a man's union. You see, we've only one lady on the branch committee. All the others are men. They, in their hearts, really think a woman's place is in the home. Beryl Huffinley, secretary of the Leeds Trades Council at the time of the strike, had the strike committee meeting in their headquarters. It couldn't meet at the union headquarters because it was unofficial. Huffinley explained why it was so difficult for women to participate more actively in the union. By the time they'd done a day's work and got home, and there's a meal to make, the washing to see to, and the house to clean, there was probably the kids to sort out, and there was everything else to do. So a night at a branch meeting didn't count very high on the list of priorities, and could you blame any of them? She described the women workers in the cotton, textile, and clothing industries. These industries didn't want to employ women. They only wanted to employ a pair of hands. Some of the women described being thrown out of the union official Harry Yates's office. They said, quote, Yates was disgusted with women who couldn't do better than serve egg and bacon for dinner and who challenged his authority to make decisions. He had to go on television to tell these women to get back to work in the kitchen. He didn't have time to speak to them. Gould's interviews confirmed the power of the women's self-organization. One of the women working in Benjamin Simon's factory described the impact of the pickets from colliers turning up outside their factory. Quote, we were holding a meeting in the canteen deciding then what we were going to do about supporting colliers. When some of us came and said, there's pickets outside. Well, that more or less clinched it with the pickets being out there. We said down tools, and out we went. The strike was not, as the Times indicated, the work of left-wing agitators, but a collective surge of anger and frustration by thousands. Two of the lead shop stewards, Gertie and Jim Roach, were socialists, but the strike didn't start in the factories where they worked. Gertie Roach replied to those who took the agitator line on the strike in a letter to the Yorkshire Evening Post in February while the strike was still going on. At every meeting, it's been obvious the women are intensely involved, unleashing years of resentment. Do the employers realize that at last we are moving into the 20th century? Almost every day reference is made to equal rights for women. Do they think this has no effect on the women who form 78% of the industry's labor force? Many have families to feed and homes to tend. Think of the organization and determined effort necessary to keep this up, year after year. The revolt is due not to a handful of left-wingers, but to something far deeper, years of neglect by the employers. At a mass meeting on Woodhouse Moor towards the end of the strike, Jim Roach addressed the skilled men in the industry and warned them of the need for unity with women workers. I want to warn the men of this industry that you have to concern yourselves more and more with the women's conditions. When a woman looks at her wages and thinks of the hours she works and her conditions, she knows she is a slave. 5 months after the 1970 strike, male cutters and colliers tried to negotiate a further increase in wages for themselves, and 40 of them were sacked. Gertie Roach described the attitude of many of the women workers when she tried to get support for the sacked men. The men had just wiped out everything that had been gained in relation to unity during the strike by that very act, going behind everybody else's back and trying to negotiate a very high increase for themselves. Well, you can't do this. If you want to lead people, you've got to be open, haven't you? She said. The most extensive source about the strike is actually a film called Leeds United, made in 1973 and televised in 1974 as a BBC play for today. Written by Colin Welland and directed by Roy Battersby, the film was based on real events and filmed in Leeds using many of those who participated in the strike as extras and, very importantly, as advisors. At that time, it was the most expensive drama ever produced for television, with a cast of 300 and a £154,000 budget. That was very expensive. You also have to remember, millions of people saw this film because at that point there were only 3 television channels. So you only had BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV. That was it. No cable, no nothing. So a lot of people saw these programs when they were on. The director, Roy Battersby, was one of a group of writers, directors, and producers who came to prominence in the 60s and 70s for their work on one-off plays, broadcast in a regular weekly slot, first as the Wednesday play and then as Play for Today. Ken Loach, the best known out of this group, said that he wanted to challenge assumptions and provide a democratic space for suppressed voices through films. We have to write our history, keep it vivid, not let it be forgotten, he said. Leeds United is in this tradition. influenced by developments in British theatre and cinema, and freed from the TV studios by new technology. Politically committed scripts were part of TV's cultural revolution, if you like, in this period. This was a revolution in which audiences became used to the working class describing their own experiences and to having writers and actors take up those experiences and expand on them in fictional forms. So summarizing and condensing events, the film shows the complex relationships between workers and stewards, stewards and union officials and bosses. Presenting the story of the strike through the story of individuals, acting very much as part of a collective, emotionalizes and personalizes the story. One of the strengths of Leeds United as history is that it was made not long after the strike, in the streets and factories of Leeds. As with many of the Wednesday plays and plays for today, the period it is about is also the period in which it was made, and I think that's very important. Describing the process of involving clothing workers in filming, Battersby pointed to the power of the collective experience the strikers brought to it. And this is a quote. "We were able, by being very close to the Shop Stewards Committee, to mobilize really thousands of Leeds clothing workers, the large majority of whom had participated in the strike 2 or 3 years before. So, for example, the big Leeds Town Hall meeting, our contribution to that is the actors and 50 extras, and the rest are Leeds clothing workers. So yes, the people in the strike were very active. And of course all the women in the factories where we went, some of whom adopted us very strongly, had all of course participated, and they opened a lot of secrets to us." The film caused a big uproar in the newspapers among union officials, employers, and the Communist Party, who objected to the role played by one of its members in the film. Because of the controversy, an arts talk show called In Vision was televised the next night and devoted the whole of one of its programs to the film. Representatives of the employers were there, union official, the one that the women mentioned as having been so negative about their strike, 3 women shop stewards, including Gertie Roach, and the producer of the film participated, and somebody called Ken Trod. They wouldn't let Roy Battersby be on the program, so he was outside. He wasn't allowed in. In the local papers, the women were portrayed as being very critical of the language used in the film. There was a bit of swearing. Some of the strikers said bloody and bugger. During the course, that tells you the times as well, how they've changed. During the course of the In Vision program, Gertie Roach said she thought the use of language was justified because of the strength of the emotion and anger of the strikers. Battersby was very worried and went to Leeds to wait outside one of the factories in which the women were working who'd been particularly helpful. And this is a quote from him. "And I was very nervous, and they started coming out. I was across the road from where they were coming out through the gate, and they spotted me, and I thought, oh God, here we go. And there was this great cheer, and they all crowded out across the road, and I'm like, so you liked it then? We loved it." And these were the same people quoted in the newspapers making negative comments about the language used in the film. So I said, what did all that mean then, all that talk about you don't speak like that? And one of them said, oh, that's just for him indoors. If he thought I spoke like that, he'd break my neck. So, again, a sign of the times, we hope. For some at the time, the calling off of the strike was a betrayal. The strike was spreading, and with a clear leadership, more could have been won by the strikers. For others, the story is of a limited victory. The wage rise was eventually forthcoming and was more substantial than had ever been won before. But as I've already said, the industry was already really disappearing. For the women involved in the strike, there was qualitative change in their understanding of what the trade union movement could offer them, but also a recognition of the role they could play and of their importance to the union. Sylvia Patey-Johns confirmed in an interview that this was one of the key outcomes of the strike. Women realized it was important to act, she said, not to accept fate, but to do something about it. Now, we'll see if this works. You had challenges with the sound. So with